that transformed those workers in a huge plant of 7,000 people, regardless of their politics, race, sex, to where I was looked at and respected as a leader because what I believed in and what I practiced every day.
We have Jon Melrod on the Zoom. Jon Melrod is a current human rights attorney and former auto organizer in Milwaukee at the American Motors Corporation. Jon, welcome to the program. Thanks for talking to us.
Thanks for inviting me, and I'm glad I'm finally here. I kind of confused the time a bit, but I appreciate your patience.
No worries, absolutely, and thanks for hopping on, and thanks for being willing to talk to us. And so, you know, your book, and I have it at home. I don't have it with me, but I have finished reading it. It's called Fighting Times: Organizing on the Front Lines of the Class War, and you wrote your book because, you know, you got a cancer diagnosis, and there is good reason to believe that it's associated with your work in industry. And so your kids have asked you, you know, why did you do that? But, you know, you got a college degree and all this. And so you wanted to kind of write a memoir and explain, you know, the importance in your mind at that point, and I think still to this day, the importance of organizing the working class, you know, as such, you know, building labor power for working people and believing in that as an avenue towards social change, you know, really over and above a lot of other things, right? You know, you came out of Students for a Democratic Society, and after the split, you were part, you know, there was a bunch of different organizations in Students for a Democratic Society, and some of them went, you know, with, you know, a terroristic route, and some of them were more, some of them were, I don't know, maybe there was some electoral groups, I can't remember exactly, there was a bunch of groups, but the group that you went out of the SDS with was focused on labor as kind of the central key to social change. So can you explain that to us? What is it about labor that convinced you those, you know, I don't know, I don't want to make you feel too bad, 40, 50 years ago? What was it about labor that convinced you all those years ago that labor is the key to changing the world, and what do you think about that theory now?
You know, there's an anecdote in the book that I think really speaks to the political trajectory that I followed. And you're right, there were not that many of the student groups after SDS broke up that had a political view that to really change society in a fundamental way, it required mobilizing the working class. That it couldn't just be students in student towns on campuses that had been the most active during the Vietnam War, but it required a much larger movement where the power lay, which was with the working class. And for me, there was a specific story, even as a college student, that led me into the direction that I followed, going into an auto plant for 13 years. And I think it was my freshman year, so we're talking about 1968 or 69. I had gone to a lecture by the president of the United Farm Workers in Wisconsin. And that was not directly affiliated with Cesar Chavez's farm workers, but we were hoping to grow in that direction. And we were organizing in the canneries in Wisconsin, in the fields in Wisconsin, as well as on the campus at the UW-Madison to build support for the farm workers movement. I was asked to come speak with Manuel Salas, who was the spokesman for the United Farm Workers in Wisconsin, to a group of steelworkers who were participating in the School for Workers in Madison, which is traditionally where workers come from around the state to spend a week in Madison, studying labor history, studying time study, grievance handling, etc. And at that school, that particular week, it was United Steelworkers from around the country. And Manuel spoke and explained how the conditions in the fields were such that farm workers didn't have bathrooms, that didn't have breaks, that pesticides were being sprayed right over the heads of the farm workers. And we have been part of the grape boycott that was an international and national boycott of grapes picked in California from 22 of the grape fields that were on strike, demanding a United Farm Workers contract. At the end of that discussion with the steelworkers, we asked them if they would join us on a picket line in front of Kroger's grocery store where we were boycotting grapes. One of them put up their hand, and I was a 1960s college kid, and I had long hair, and we were part of the counterculture. And I looked at the guy getting up, and I wondered, am I in the wrong room? I mean, he looked like a typical steel worker. Not to be stereotypical, but he had a big belly, he had short hair, and in those days, the cultural divide, in one sense, was as great as it is today, except that there were many more people on our side of it. And he put up his hand and he says, I make a motion that the steel workers show Brother Salas what we do when we form a picket line. I make a motion that all of us join the picket line this Friday at the Kroger's grocery store. Picket line came around, about 50 steelworkers were out there, militant as hell, belly to back type picketing, not letting people come into the grocery store. And then at a certain signal, all those steelworkers went in, filled up grocery carts with the ice cream on the bottom, lined them up at the checkout counters, and just walked out of the store singing Solidarity Forever. And when they got to the one lyric that said, we shall build a new world of the ashes of the old, I said, that's where I want to be. Because that's a hell of a revolutionary sentiment, a hell of a sentiment for changing the whole society, to build a new society out of the ashes of the old. And that's where I made my decision that when I left Madison, I would go into the working class to organize and to spread the word of building a new society.
I think that really, I think that's a great encapsulation of the, of why labor is. And I agree with the theory that labor, if you want to change the world, you want to make the world better, labor is really at the center of what's going to have to happen. And I think that's a great explanation of it and how it can bring people, from disparate backgrounds to supporting the same, to supporting each other. I've even had something kind of similar. One of our first ever interviews on this program was with two nurses who had just been key in organizing a union at their hospital in Pennsylvania. And one of them described himself as a conservative constitutionalist. I can't remember. He had some other silly adjective. And the other one said, I'm an ultra liberal or whatever, right? So these are, clearly kind of at opposite ends of one another. But the amount of love and respect they had for one another and for their industry and the job that they perform and their coworkers was really evident. And actually the conservative, and I could even tell, and I need to follow up. It's been almost 4 years. I need to follow up with these guys and have them back on again to see how they're doing. But the conservative, you could see that he was undergoing as a 50-year-old man, right? This is not some young guy who's being politicized. This is an older gentleman who's been around, who has already kind of got set in his ways. He was undergoing at the time something of a political transformation, right? And he was talking about how, prior to organizing this union with my Black women colleagues, I was really upset at the Black Lives Matter movement. I really thought it was bad. I can't remember if he thought it was a terrorist organization or what, but he was very, antagonistic towards it. And he said, I still can't say that I agree with every single thing that they say, but I understand it now after having had these Black women in my home and having dinner with them and being in their homes and having dinner with them and talking about having a union and talking about fighting for our first contract. It's really transformative and beautiful, and something that you can create a new world from the ashes of the old. And it's it's a beautiful song and a great testimony. And that testimony from your book is actually counterposed to another interaction that you had with steelworkers that really kind of showed the kind of the different ways that these groups can interact with one another in one situation where they are being kind of used against solidaristic action, and in another where they are being part of solidaristic action. Can you talk about when you were, opposing the Vietnam War and you were, basically being attacked by these people in factories?
Yeah, well, that was way early. I'm really dating myself on this one, but in give me 1 second. It would have been 1967. There was a national day of shutting down induction centers to protest the Vietnam War. And I was in high school at that time in Vermont, and we organized a group of high school students to go over to Manchester, New Hampshire, where the induction center was, to picket and show the recruits that they were bringing in to the induction center that there was opposition to the war. And when we came into the town, I'll never forget, I assumed that people would greet us and understand why we were there and coming in. And hanging from the windows of the old brick factories in Manchester, where they used to make shoes and textiles, and these are back in the days when it was a vibrant economy in New Hampshire, industrial economy, they had hung banners out of the windows that said "Better dead than red," and commies go home, and that type of sort of mindless reaction to what we were doing. And, it stuck with me for many years. That is, why aren't these guys whose kids that are going to Vietnam understanding why we're standing up for them and us? And to show you how far the pendulum could swing, when I went to work in auto in 1972, the first time I ran for union steward, and I was in a very unique auto plant. We had one steward for every 35 employees on the line, and that steward only had to work a half hour a day and was paid by the company for the rest of the day for union business. We had a right to strike over all grievances, and we had 100% voluntary overtime. So it was a very progressive rank and file led local, very unusual. It had survived the Ruther days. Most people think that Ruther was a great hero of the working class and had built the UAW. Fact be told, if you go back in the history, and it's in my book, when Ruther came to power and kicked out the leftists, the radicals, the socialists, the Reds in the UAW, he transformed it step by step into a union that was based less and less on the rank and file and more on statesman-like bargaining with the auto companies. And he gave up the right to strike, stewards for every 35 individuals, and voluntary overtime to get some better wages, to get some COLA on the contract, to get some vacation time. And that was really misleadership, because the power of the union had grown out of the fact that the rank and file on the shop floor could take direct action to fight grievance, to fight racial discrimination, to fight women's being paid separate amounts per hour than the men next to them. And the first time I ran for steward, I drove three other guys to the union hall to vote. And then there was me. That made 4 of us. When I went back into the factory the next day, I had only gotten 3 votes. That meant one of the guys I drove out there didn't even vote for me. And I was pretty shell-shocked. I had these high hopes that I was going to be recognized as a union leader and as a militant, and it didn't come to pass at first. After I had worked there 13 years or so, when I ran for the bargaining committee, some 4,000 people voted for me. And that was after 13 years of being on the line, of leading direct actions, of leading walkouts, of leading work stoppages, that people came to respect me. That what was not the main issue was my politics. The main issue was I was seen as somebody who had class consciousness, who had militancy, and stood up for all the workers, regardless of their politics, regardless of their race, regardless of their sex. And that transformed those workers in a huge plant of 7,000 people to where I was looked at and respected as a leader because what I believed in and what I practiced every day.
Hey, 5 seconds, just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
Right. And that's the, I think, much more than having the perfect kind of political line is, doing the work. And I was listening in preparation for the interview to some other interviews that you gave and one with Barry Eidlin. Y'all spoke about the mundane work that goes into being a union steward or a union activist, a union member, a participatory union member, and the politics of a person really are less important, I have found, and you have found, to getting your coworkers to trust you. It's less important than being good at the mundane stuff, being somebody that is there, being somebody that is respected, even being somebody that's good at their job, right? It's difficult to...
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you really do actually have to be good at your job to be an effective unionist, right? Because if you're not good at your job, one, your employer could fire you and then be rid of the whole problem, and it would be difficult to make the case, at the National Labor Relations Board to get you rehired. But for another, nobody enjoys working with a layabout, somebody who sucks at their job and who everybody has to pick up their slack for. It's not fun to work with those people, right? And so it's if you are associated with that kind of lackadaisical work ethic and you're not good at your job, then the union or then the employer might actually just keep you around and have you be a scapegoat for the union, right? And say, look, the union's keeping this lazy ass guy around, and wouldn't your job be so much easier if I could fire him? But look, it's the union's fault, right? And anyway, I don't know, I got on a tangent, but
you're 100% right. You're 100% right. I mean, that was one of the things that I said when I went in. As hard as it was to work on that assembly line, 8 hours a day, putting in taillights on one car per minute, I never once let up in how hard I worked or how people viewed my work. But to show you that what people will respect you for, it was only 3 or 4 months after I had gone to work. I was still a kid. I was 21. And I didn't get a break in the morning. And on the assembly line, they'd have relief people come by, take your job for 5 cars, and you take a break. Well, I didn't get my morning break. And everybody around me, particularly the high seniority workers, started saying, Melrod, are you some kind of company man? I said, what do you mean? They said, don't let them fuck with you like that. Take your break. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? And they said, well, fucking walk off the line, go sit down in the cafeteria and take a break. And I said to myself, damn, I'm going to get fired for this. And I don't want to be in this plant for 4 months and be out of a job. But I did it. I took the taillights, I threw them in the car, I walked off, and I sat down in the cafeteria. And I saw the foreman headed for me, swinging his arms, coming up the aisle. and he started yelling, "Melrod, you're fucking fired. Get out of this factory. Don't come back onto the line." And I said, "Oh shit, this is serious." My steward walked up. Out of nowhere, somebody had alerted him. And he walks up to me and he says, "Melrod, you go back to work." He said, "The contract says you got a right to a break. That foreman can't fire you for you exercising your right to break." And that steward had a little blue button. Back in the old days in the UAW, stewards all wore blue buttons, and we were called blue button stewards. And I said to myself, when he sent me back to work, and I saw that foreman just raging to be put down like that, I said, someday I'm going to be a blue button steward. And that became my first goal, is to be a steward, which I became a year later on the next election, and worked my way up to chief steward, to department chairman, to the education committee. I was part of the delegation that was sent to France to meet with the unions at Renault, the French auto company that bought American Motors. And I was elected to the bargaining committee. So it just shows you, if you put your head down and you go to work. And I've said to young socialists who get out in front of the factory selling a socialist newspaper, that's not the way you organize people. There's nothing wrong with saying you're a socialist, but you got to first dig in and be there every day and show people that you got the courage to stand up to the boss, that you have the courage to defend other people before you start talking to people about socialism or transforming society in its entirety. So those are a lot of important lessons that I hope to have conveyed in the book. We've sold about 3,700 of them, which is, I'm told, very good for an independent author with an independent book label.
Yeah, where can people just and I'll make sure to plug this again at the end. But where would people go to buy that book? And I think at 50% off right now.
It's at 50% off. So I think the book is only about $7.50. So we put it on sale because we're running low. We had printed 4,000 copies and we're down to the last couple hundred. But if people go to pmpress.org, that's the publisher, and they put in Fighting Times or Jon Melrod, the book will come up and you can order it at that 50% discount. No need for a discount code. It's just been put on sale. But I think, for a lot of your listeners, it's a lot of young people have come to me and said how inspired they were by reading the book. And, the brother who was here from Teamsters Mobilize, a whole group of Teamsters Mobilize activists read the book and then talked to me about it, which was really exciting to be with young people, because these guys are standing up not just to the companies, but to O'Brien. And to me, O'Brien is a gangster, no different than when the Hoffas ran the union. You don't go to talk to the Republicans about labor. The Republicans are anti-labor. So let's get that straight before you even consider the idea. So there's a lot that we still got to do. We had hoped that O'Brien might be a reform candidate, and Labor Notes invited him to be a key speaker 2 Labor Notes ago. And I think a lot of us in the reform movement need to look at ourselves and say, look, don't fall for the promises, fall for the actions. O'Brien did not prove himself on the ground in terms of what he could deliver for the Teamsters. And, it's a mistake then to follow him politically when he goes to accept an invitation from Donald Trump to speak about labor, because we all know, those on this program, those listening to this program, that Donald Trump is a class traitor, or maybe he's not. He's actually a class advocate for his class.
Yeah, that's the problem. Yeah. He's not a class traitor. Yeah, he would be great. We would let Donald Trump, the class traitor, would be a much better person, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so back to the book. you wanted to write this kind of for your own kids and for posterity and kind of to explain some of the some of the reasons that even though the work was dangerous and more dangerous even than it is today, even as it is still dangerous today, why you felt like that was important, and fortunately, your cancer diagnosis was some years ago, and you've lived much longer than they anticipated that you would, and so I think that's obviously great for everybody, and great for your kids, and great for the folks that are able to read this book now because of that. But another reason for writing the book it was to talk to folks like Jose and folks who are trying to do what they can to turn their unions into fighting militant organizations that are not afraid to take on the boss and not afraid to challenge union misleadership where that needs to happen. And so what are some of the key lessons that you think folks today need to learn from the history and activities of you and folks like you? Because there's a long line of reform movements, whether they're called that or not, in unions spanning decades. And what are some of the key lessons from those from those movements that you think folks should take?
Yeah. One of the most important things that defined our caucus, which was the Fighting Times Caucus, was that from the very beginning, we identified two pillars of our work in the factory. One was fighting white chauvinism anytime that we were in a situation where white chauvinism was being utilized by the company. We were there to oppose it. Whenever a Black worker was discriminated against in terms of the job assignment, in terms of treatment by a racist boss or foreman, we were there with a petition, with a group grievance, with an article in the Fighting Times. It was known that we would stand up on that issue and take whatever heat that came back at us. And that included, at one point, we were called on by the United League of Mississippi that put out a call. The Klan had revitalized itself in the South, and it was about I'm blanking out. Must have been the very early 80s. And we organized a busload of workers from the factory to go down there and to march with the United League against the Klan. And we caught a lot of heat. There were 7,000 workers in the factory. A lot of them were rural white farmers who worked on the farm part of the day and in the factory the other part. And they were, they reacted pretty negatively to us saying, look, we're going to go take on the Klan. But we went down there, we marched, and the irony of it was, I don't know if you'd call it an irony, actually, but as the bus pulled up, and in my book, there's a picture of this, it stopped in front of a building, and on the top of it, I read Tupelo Police Department. And out walked 20 Klansmen with their robes on, with their pointed hoods, carrying axe handles, and they were the police. They had come out of the police station. And I said to myself, oh my God, who do you call when the Klan attacks you on the march, when the Klan are the police and the police are the Klan? And we marched, and it was a very successful, very inspiring march because it was led by a lot of young Black workers who had been to Vietnam, and that had changed the equation. In the first pickup truck that led the march, I walked up to look at what was in the bed, and it was filled up with weapons from Vietnam that these soldiers had brought back with them. So we had entered a new era, which was young Blacks were not going to take bullshit from the Klan and be intimidated by the Klan, because they had already been to Vietnam and they had already seen what power they had in organizing with other Black vets to oppose the Vietnam War. And that was really an important lesson down there. But when we got back up to the factory, we put out a full description of the march, taking on the Klan, and explained why the Klan was anti-union and anti-working class, that they had always been utilized to bust unions. They'd been utilized, and if you look at it, it was Trump's father who was marching in New York in a Klan march about keeping Blacks out of housing in New York. And he was one of the 6 people who was arrested. Now, that story should be told a lot wider than it is, that Trump is a direct descendant of a Klan leader. But when we went back into the factory, people all of a sudden began to understand and talk to us more about why we had been willing to put ourselves on the line, to go down south. And we translated that when we came back into how we saw the struggle in the plant, that we had a struggle against racism as hard as we did against a line speed up or, a change in our jobs that made the workload too unfair. So that was one plank. The second plank was the same treatment that women were being doled out was sexist, was male chauvinist. There were foremen going around telling women that they would give them a better job if they would sleep with them. And we exposed all of that kind of stuff in the Fighting Times newsletter. And, we gained a lot of respect for being willing to always take on those 2 battles and be at the forefront and doing it every day. I mean, if people get a copy of the Fighting Times, I think they'll learn a lot about how those struggles are so integral to the overall working class struggle that you on the job make that a part of what you do. Right. And if I could just briefly say to you that part of the lesson was I wanted to bring these lessons to young workers. I spent the last year and a half helping organize the Blue Bottle Independent Union, which are Blue Bottle coffee workers in the Massachusetts area. And, they've all read the book. And at first they said, oh, the other workers aren't interested in the union. There's been a total transformation. Once we petitioned for an election for certification and the union won the election, all of a sudden these same young workers that were hesitant and said people aren't that interested, their lives changed. They said every day we feel solidarity on the job. We feel like we're standing up for other workers. This has been the best thing that's happened in our lives. And now they're spreading that union to the West Coast. And it's an independent union because they didn't feel that any of the unions they talked to that were traditional business unions would in fact respect their rank and file democracy and their willingness to take action on the job to get conditions changed.
Right. And, just to have I don't know if this is, I'm not a very big theory guy, right? But I don't know if this is what you would call dialectics, but there's a flip side to the importance of sticking to principles and standing up to union misleadership and fighting for more when some people are saying it's not time yet. You can't do that. There's a flip side to that you really do have to you do have to know when you can't fight for more. When actually yes. when it actually is the case that fighting for more is going to be detrimental either to to the organization or so detrimental to the company that it goes under, or particularly I think the more common thing is the former than the latter. Typically companies are not actually at risk for going under from union demands and contract negotiations, but where you can see that a company is willing to destroy your organization if you don't accept something. There are times when you have to accept concessions, and knowing when those times are and appropriately counseling your members is just as important a part of being a good union militant as as maybe even the easier times of throwing shit at the walls, right? And you tell a really a really powerful and I could tell difficult story towards the end of your book where you had to do exactly that. And actually you were faced with some people on the negotiating committee who were inclined to do the other thing, to not give appropriate counsel to the members, to try to act like they were the pure militants, and then they were voting down the contract because it was a sellout contract and all of this, and you were very antagonistic towards those folks. And so could you just explain to us the situation and why you felt like the appropriate counsel is some amount of concessions, and then what you did to kind of wrangle in these people that were trying to run off the run off the reservation and bring them back?
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good point. And it's a really good point that you picked up out of the book, because it's oftentimes hard for us who are radicals and militants to sort of, exactly as you say, realize there's times when you've got to pull back, and you're responsible for people's jobs and their families and their livelihoods. And in 1985, we were confronted with a situation where Renault, the French automaker, was in over 50% ownership of American Motors. And Renault announced that they would be taking away, I believe it was 13 or 14 non-negotiable demands that were in our contract, because we still in 85 had the best contract in the UAW. And regardless of what they said, we set out to fight it. And we called for a strike vote, and we had a unanimous vote to strike to save our jobs, to fight the concessions. And people were ready to walk out. People passed mass petitions with thousands of signatures demanding that we not concede the benefits of our contract. But, we had read, those of us who were activists, we had studied Automotive News, the industry newspaper for auto. We had studied the economy. We had studied what the situation was with Renault. And the fact of the matter was that the two Renault models that we were producing in Kenosha, Wisconsin, were being produced at a less cost in France, and that the unions in France were demanding that production be brought back to France so that they would have jobs. And we were confronted with a difficult situation in the end, because it became very clear that financially, economically, Renault could in fact move that work. And that it would have been easy to say, to hell with you, we're not accepting any concessions. But when we caucused amongst ourselves, the young radicals that were on the bargaining committee, we really realized that that could mean the shutdown of the plant. And that would mean that there would be no pensions paid to those people who were were receiving pensions, and to those people who would be soon to receive pensions. And there would be no transfer rights for workers ever out of that factory. And it was really tough to come in and say to people, well, we feel like we've got to accept this, even though our tradition has always been to fight all concessions. The fact that we kept those rights that we had up until 1985, the right to strike, the number of stewards, and the voluntary overtime, that we were faced with a tough decision. And in the bargaining committee, there was a vote. And after we discussed it, there were two holdouts. And they were sort of loudmouth, we're never going to be called the sellouts, and I got up and I said, it's easy for you two to say that, because the rest of us here are going to make the decision that has to be made to save jobs for as long as we can, to guarantee pensions, etc. And they said, no, we're not going to be sellouts. And I said, look, I'm going to tell you something. If you don't get on board with the rest of us and vote with us to save what we can save, we're going to be at the gates tomorrow with a flyer putting out exactly what you're jeopardizing and exactly what you're not willing to have the courage to take a stand on. And in the end, the president of the union got up to the membership and said, would you rather vote to have no job, or would you rather vote to have a big 3 contract, which would keep us working, which would keep the engine factory working, which would guarantee the pensions of 17,000, pardon me, 17,000 retirees, which would grant transfer rights to all those people who in the future were still working here when this was bought by another auto company, which it was by Chrysler a year later. And literally thousands of workers got to transfer to Chrysler Pants and finish out their 30 years and secure good retirements. So sometimes you got to bite that bullet and be willing to stand up in front of people and take the hit to say, we've got to do this. But in the end, people respected us for doing that, because people aren't dumb. They don't want to vote themselves out of a job. And, you know, you can psych people up and work people up into saying, to hell with the company, we're not taking any concessions. But we made the better decision of that. And I feel like, you know, it saved a lot of people a lot of pensions and a lot of jobs going forward.
Right. I agree. The book is called Fighting Times, Organizing on the Front Lines of the Class War. You can get it from PM Press. It's a great book. There's some other stories in here that we obviously were not able to cover in particular, you know, just want to highlight as a teaser for the book. Hopefully you'll go and buy it. The story of Melrod was fired from American Motors, and over the course of a multi-year NLRB case, he was eventually rehired and walked back into the job with a big, like, comically sized check picture of his back pay that he got from the NLRB. Their newsletter, Fighting Times, was also sued for like $1 million in a lawsuit that was $4 million. Wow. Surreptitiously funded the lawsuit by American Motors. And in that, over the course of the hearing, you hear lots of, really just terrible stories about the supervisor. The supervisor was abusive both to women and animals, horrifically so. And they won. The spoiler alert is that they won. They did not, Jon Melrod did not have to write a $4 million check to the supervisor who sued him for defamation, was the claim in the newsletter. So really great book. Some other good stories in there. Check it out. Fighting Times, Organizing on the Front Lines of the Class War. The author is Jon Melrod. Jon, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you too for having me on. I really appreciate it.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.